Yeah, so no wonder Lord of the Rings aged better than Game of Thrones. One production spent 14 months meticulously cementing a finished masterpiece, while the other ran completely out of source material by 2016 and choked at the finish line. Peter Jackson arrived in New Zealand with 3 completed, fully bound volumes published by J.R.R. Tolkien by 1954, meaning every major character death, structural climax, and narrative payoff had been set in stone for nearly half a century. The production team possessed an immutable roadmap that allowed concept artists Alan Lee and John Howe to spend years aligning visual sketches with a definitive literary ending. Conversely, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss signed their HBO contracts in 2007 under the assumption that George R.R. Martin would finish his 7-book epic before the cameras caught up to his text. That gamble collapsed during the production of Season 6 in 2016, when the showrunners officially outpaced the published source material and were forced to rely on brief bullet points provided during a strategy meeting in Santa Fe. Without a structural anchor, the writers shifted from adapting dense, multi-layered political intrigue to improvising commercial television scripts on the fly. This lack of architectural planning forced the production into a desperate scramble, swapping out long-term narrative geometry for sudden shock value to hit their broadcast deadlines. An exact structural countdown exposed the cracks long before the source material ran completely dry. Peter Jackson spent 274 consecutive days between October 1999 and December 2000 shooting all 3 films simultaneously to ensure absolute mechanical symmetry. This mathematical timeline allowed the editing base to calibrate identical pacing across an eventual 686 million theatrical runtime, locking the physical distance of Middle-earth into a rigid, believable framework. Game of Thrones completely abandoned this temporal discipline during its final stretch, shrinking standard 10-episode seasons into 7 episodes for Season 7 and a mere 6 for Season 8. Slashed runtimes instantly destroyed the established geography of Westeros, forcing armies to teleport across thousands of miles within single commercial breaks. In the early seasons, King Robert's court required a full episode to travel from King's Landing to Winterfell, and by 2019, characters bypassed weeks of naval and horseback transit to settle geopolitical conflicts within minutes. This logistical collapse meant the showrunners prioritized rapid plot progression over basic spatial logic, effectively treating the continent like a small theater stage rather than a sprawling continent. The destruction of internal logic directly mangled how characters reacted to severe psychological trauma. The writers spent 70 episodes framing Daenerys Targaryen as a messianic figure breaking chains across Essos, only to pivot her into a genocidal maniac over the span of a single 80-minute broadcast in May 2019. Now compare that to Frodo Baggins, whose mental decay is calculated across 558 minutes of on-screen torment. We see the physical toll in the dark veins tracking down his neck, the increasing paranoia towards Samwise, and the dead look in his eyes that builds across 3 separate movies. When Frodo finally claims the ring at the crack of doom, it hits like an earned tragedy because the story spent 9 hours layering his psychological exhaustion. Game of Thrones treated complex human evolution like a light switch, trading decades of audience investment for raw shock value. The obsession with subverting expectations completely blinded the writers to the purpose of thematic gravity. Tolkien anchored Middle-earth to absolute moral anchors like mercy and fellowship. Think about Bilbo sparing Gollum in that dark cave. That single, quiet moment of pity ripples across decades, ultimately saving the entire world at Mount Doom. It proves that the smallest people can shatter systemic evil through sheer moral backbone. Game of Thrones did the exact opposite. It hooked us by being a brutal, brilliant critique of medieval power politics. Idealism got your head chopped off. Just look at Ned Stark in Season 1. But the showrunners completely hollowed out that intellectual weight during the 2019 finale. They ended 8 years of complex, bloody institutional warfare with a literal popularity contest. Tyrion actually argued Bran should rule because he had the best story. What a joke. It reduced a gritty commentary on feudal politics into a lazy meta-joke about television writing. And by putting a detached mystic on the throne, the show disproved its own realism. Cynicism sold tickets for a decade, but it lacked the structural power to deliver emotional closure. The crowning of King Elessar inside Minas Tirith succeeds visually because the camera tracks a slow physical descent where a newly anointed monarch intentionally lowers his crown before 4 diminutive halflings. When Viggo Mortensen uttered the words, "My friends, you bow to no one," the emotional payoff hits instantly because the audience spent 9 theatrical hours watching these specific characters navigate a strict, unforgiving social hierarchy. The visual contrast of an entire civilization kneeling to 4 dirt-stained hobbits works because every single inch of that respect was earned through physical and emotional torment. Conversely, the May 2019 demise of Cersei Lannister inside the Red Keep abandoned years of built-up dramatic tension in favor of a sudden, unceremonious collapse of masonry. The narrative spent multiple seasons establishing her complex rivalries with Tyrion, Daenerys, and Maggie the Frog's prophecy, leading viewers to anticipate a definitive, poetic confrontation. But instead, she and Jaime were simply crushed beneath a pile of random falling bricks, a visual choice that left the audience completely detached from the screen. This sudden dismissal of a primary antagonist felt like a production team clearing characters off a chessboard to hit a runtime limit rather than a calculated, satisfying resolution to a lifelong blood feud. The scene swapped out earned dramatic catharsis for empty shock value, reducing a terrifying tyrant to a mere casualty of structural collapse. A narrative cannot survive when its main antagonists are defeated by a single stealth strike. The showrunners spent 73 episodes hyping the Night King as an apocalyptic, existential menace, only to dismantle his entire army during a single, visually unreadable battle in April 2019. The long-awaited confrontation at Winterfell was ruined by severe digital compression and terrible lighting choices, forcing millions of viewers to literally adjust their television brightness settings just to decipher basic choreography. Tactically, the episode was an absolute joke, featuring absurd decisions like sending a vanguard of Dothraki cavalry straight into pitch-black darkness without any infantry support. Conversely, Sauron's forces maintain constant, creeping dread across all 9 hours of the film trilogy because their physical movements dictate logical military strategies from Amon Hen to the Blackgate. Peter Jackson used clear daytime choreography, physical miniatures, and distinct silhouette designs to ensure the audience always understood the exact stakes of an orc invasion. The Battle of Helm's Deep remains a high-water mark because the rain, the ladders, and the breaching of the Deeping Wall followed strict cause and effect logic. Game of Thrones traded this tactical discipline for cheap cinematic convenience, ending an 8-year winter with a single mid-air knife trick that felt completely disconnected from the narrative. The visual collapse on screen mirrored a complete breakdown of authority behind the camera lenses. Peter Jackson famously risked his entire career by fighting Miramax executives who demanded he compress J.R.R. Tolkien's sprawling masterpiece into a single 2-hour film. Instead, Jackson walked away, secured a partnership with New Line Cinema, and embedded himself in New Zealand for over half a decade alongside Weta Workshop artisans to perfect every single physical prop, map, and language translation. This level of creative obsession stands in stark contrast to the documented behavior of David Benioff and D.B. Weiss during the twilight of their HBO run. By 2018, the showrunner duo openly admitted to feeling creatively exhausted, yet they refused to hand the reins over to fresh writers who actually cared about the material. Instead, they slashed the final season orders down to just 6 episodes, rushing the complex political conclusions to quickly pivot toward a lucrative 9-figure production deal they had signed with Netflix. This corporate distraction resulted in immense negligence on set, leaving modern anomalies like a Starbucks cup and a plastic water bottle visible in the final broadcast frames. Their evident haste transformed a once revered cultural juggernaut into a rushed, messy checklist, prioritizing personal career transit over narrative finality. The ultimate legacy of a franchise is decided by its final, definitive frame of footage. The longevity of a franchise relies entirely on its own rewatchability, a metric where The Lord of the Rings remains utterly undefeated decades after its theatrical release. Jackson's films have seamlessly transitioned into a permanent fixture of internet culture, generating thousands of daily memes and securing a spot as a mandatory holiday viewing tradition for millions of households globally. This enduring relevance stems from a satisfying conclusion that rewards the audience's long-term emotional investment every time they revisit the journey. Conversely, Game of Thrones suffered an unprecedented cultural eviction the exact moment its finale aired on May 19, 2019. An angry, alienated fanbase immediately stopped buying physical box sets, canceled merchandise subscriptions, and ceased the online discussions that had fueled the show's decade-long dominance. The final episodes retroactively poisoned the earlier seasons, turning what was once a mandatory cultural phenomenon into a frustrating waste of time that people actively avoid revisiting. When an ending invalidates the very journey that preceded it, the entire narrative structure collapses in the eyes of history, rendering a historical legacy completely inert. A masterpiece maintains its value through generations, while a rushed corporate product dissolves the second the hype dies. If you had to rewatch one from start to finish this weekend, are you picking the story that stayed perfect, or the one that broke your heart?